So, Robert, you're saying comments are basically a band-aid, a stopgap measure, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're a crutch when the code itself isn't expressing the intent clearly. Think of it like trying to explain a complex idea with a lot of extra words. It's often more confusing than just showing it in a simple, straightforward way.
But how do you know when the code is truly self-explanatory? What are the signs?
Good code often reads like prose. It's clear and concise, guiding the reader effortlessly through the program's logic.
So, a lot of comments end up being outdated?
Absolutely. As code evolves, the comments often get left behind, becoming inaccurate historical records.
How do we fix that, though? Do we delete all comments and hope for the best?
Not at all. It's about using comments strategically. Think of them as notes in a musical score, not the lyrics. They provide context, but the music should be so well written, it speaks for itself.
So, what are some concrete strategies?
We can use more expressive language in the code.
That's interesting. Can you give an example?
Let's say you're doing a calculation. Instead of a comment, calculate average temperature, you can use descriptive variable names, like average temp. This gives context directly within the code.
That makes sense.
Also, use functions to break down big chunks of code into smaller, self-contained units.
So breaking down code into smaller functions can make it easier to read, right?
Exactly. And each function can have a clear, concise description.
So, what about comments that are helpful in legacy code?
If the comment helps clarify something tricky and not just reword the code, maybe they're worth keeping. But if it's just summarizing obvious code, you can rewrite or refactor.
Okay, makes sense.
You need to be disciplined, because keeping code and comments aligned requires ongoing effort.
So, the real issue is maintaining accurate, relevant comments?
Precisely. It's much better to invest time in code clarity and maintainability. Let's discuss refactoring in more detail.
Sounds good. Hey, Robert, so we've been talking about code, and I've been struggling with this concept.
Yeah, I've seen it before. Tell me more.
I wrote some code. It was a bit messy. I knew it was confusing, but I just kept adding comments to explain what each part did.
Right, that's a common pitfall. It's like putting a band-aid on a festering wound.
Yeah, but the comments were necessary, right?
Sometimes they are helpful, absolutely, but they don't fix the root cause. Clean code, when you can read what it's doing just by looking at the structure, well, that's where you win.
So, what do you mean by clean code?
Clean code is readable, maintainable, and easy to follow. Think functions, variables, logic flows.
So, just good organization?
Precisely. Look, imagine a really complex circuit with every wire labeled, but the connections are all scrambled. Comments are the labels, but if the circuit isn't structured correctly, the labels don't help much, do they?
No, I see what you mean. So, how do I, fix a mess I've made?
Well, step back. Look at the logic flow. Break it down into smaller, more manageable units. Then, restructure the code, making it flow clearly. If you're stuck, trace the execution path on paper or in a debugger.
Wow, so it's all about the logic. Makes sense.
Yup. Often, less code with cleaner logic is better than a lot of code with too many comments.
So, is there ever a time when comments are useful?
Absolutely. For complex algorithms, or when you're documenting special cases or edge conditions. But comments should never be used as a substitute for poor code structure.
That's really helpful, Robert. Thanks.
My pleasure, Andrew. Keep striving for clean code and you'll avoid a lot of headaches.
So, Robert, we're talking about comments, but it feels like you're saying they're not always the solution, right?
Yeah, Andrew. Comments can be useful, but often they just restate the obvious.
So, what are some of these types you're talking about? Legal stuff?
Sure. Copyright, licenses, that's got to be documented.
Okay, but what about comments that explain something?
Like, this method returns the tested responder. Doesn't that add value?
It does, but
But renaming the function to responder being tested can be a cleaner approach. Less verbiage.
So you're saying better code design, less comments?
Exactly. Often, a well-designed function speaks for itself.
That makes sense. But how do we know when a comment is truly necessary?
If the code is hard to understand even with a good name, a comment might help, but if the code is complicated, maybe restructuring the whole function is more beneficial.
Like this time matcher example. Is there a better way to represent this date, time matching?
Absolutely. Create a dedicated class. Then you have clean separation of concerns, no messy regex within the function.
I see that. Now, about that intent comment example.
That's a case where you can't avoid commenting to explain the logic.
So, the purpose of the comment is to explain the reason behind the code.
It's like a tiny explanation for why a certain choice was made, that's important for someone reading the code in the future.
It's not about the what, but the why and how.
Precisely. Comments clarify the rationale behind code that might not be evident from the implementation.
That's a good thing to keep in mind.
That's why you always aim to make the code itself explain the intent as much as possible.
So the good comments are the ones you avoid writing.
Exactly. Elegant, well-structured code minimizes the need for copious explanation.
Thanks for clarifying this, Rober.
My pleasure, Andrew.
Hey, Robert, so we're talking clean code? And it seems like warnings are a pretty important part of that, right? Like if I'm building something and I'm putting a really intense calculation into it, how can I let the person coming after me know that there's a potential risk there?
Absolutely, Andrew. Think of it like a warning sign on a construction site. You need to let people know about potential dangers. In code, that's often what comments do.
So, comments are like these warning signs, But what about, say, a test that takes forever? How do you warn about that?
Well, you could use a comment, like, don't run unless you have some time to kill. Or you could, use annotations. They're way more specific than comments. They're better for conveying the reason and impact, like at ignore / takes too long to run /, for example.
Okay, so annotations are more professional, I see. Why the shift to annotations from just comments in some cases?
Well, comments can clutter up the code, and they're less organized than annotations. Annotations are part of the structure, while comments are more like afterthoughts. Also, they help make the code easier to maintain and update in the future.
That makes sense. But what about something like simple date format, which isn't thread safe? How do I warn someone about that without just overwhelming them with warnings?
You've got to give a reason, like simple date format is not thread safe. Then you add a comment that it's necessary to create each instance independently. Clear, concise warning.
So the key is to balance comprehensiveness with conciseness, you know?
Exactly. You want to give enough information to prevent problems, but not so much that it makes the code harder to read.
Great point. So, this kind of explicit warning helps others understand the potential trade-offs in the code, right?
Absolutely. And a good warning will save a lot of headaches later on.
Thanks, Robert. That makes a lot of sense.
You're welcome, Andrew. Clean code is all about good communication. Let me know if you have any other questions.
So, Rob, you mentioned trimming whitespace. Why is that so crucial in this code snippet?
Well, Andrew, look at it like this. Extra spaces can throw off your parsing. Imagine if a list item starts with a few spaces.
Right, so it might get interpreted as a separate list, or just messed up.
Exactly. This trim function ensures those leading spaces are gone, making sure every list item is recognized correctly.
So, is there a specific reason you use trim, Q, rather than strip?
Strip removes leading and trailing white space. Trim Q might remove a specific character, if Q is for instance, \T to only remove tabs. It really depends on the exact input format.
Gotcha. So, different programming languages have different methods.
Yeah, they do, and different scenarios require a certain type of trim for the specific format.
Are there any edge cases or unexpected situations where trimming might not work as expected?
Sure. If your input has non-breaking spaces, for example, you might need a more nuanced approach. You could have hidden characters or formats that could make a simple trim fail.
Interesting. So what's the best way to handle problematic whitespace for something like parsing JSON?
For JSON parsing, there's often a JSON library that does that whitespace handling for you.
Okay, so maybe we don't always have to get into the deep detail of whitespace, but we know a trim is important and useful?
Exactly. It depends on the level of control we need.
What if this was a function to parse a file of some kind, and the formatting wasn't perfect?
We could add checks, or use a library that handles irregular input.
Right, great. Thanks, Rob.
You're welcome.
Robert, You mentioned bad comments. Can you give us a concrete example of a bad comment? And what makes it bad?
Sure. Imagine this comment, // this code is a mess, but it works. The problem isn't that it doesn't work, it's that the comment doesn't actually help.
So, it's not helpful, right? Is it just about readability?
Exactly. It's an admission of poor coding without offering any insight into why the code is a mess, or how to improve it. It's like saying, sorry, I messed up, but not saying how to fix it. Good comments would give a reason or context, possibly suggesting a future improvement.
Gotcha. But what about comments that just explain obvious things? Is that bad?
Well, comments should add value, not just restate the code. If the code is already perfectly self-explanatory, the comment is redundant and adds unnecessary noise.
So, a bad comment is basically a comment that doesn't enhance the code's readability or help someone understand it, right?
Yep, exactly. It's about providing clarity and insight.
That makes sense. So, what are some steps we can take to write better comments?
Focus on why, not that. Instead of explaining what a section of code does, explain why it does it. Also think about the user reading the code. Are comments easy to understand for them?
Wow, that's helpful.
Good comments are almost like a conversation with the next developer who will see the code.
Okay, good to know.
A bad comment is basically saying, I don't know how to write this better. Here's a comment instead.
So, proactive comments are good?
Indeed. Proactive comments help someone understand the intent of a code section, and that's better than comments that just acknowledge it's hard to understand.
Great. Thanks, Robert. Hey Robert, we're talking clean code today, and I stumbled upon something interesting. These journal comments in code modules. Lots of them, like dozens of pages of entries. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, those are vestiges of a time before proper source control. Back then, people documented every change manually.
So, source control is the answer?
Precisely. Git, for instance, tracks every commit, file modification, and even the rationale behind the change.
But what about comments? Aren't they helpful for understanding the code?
Comments, good comments, are crucial. But these massive journals, it's like reading a novel in code. Source control is far more efficient.
So, just toss them all?
Well, it depends. If the code's already under source control, these journal entries are probably redundant.
Okay, but what about complex legacy systems where source control wasn't used?
We'd have to evaluate. Sometimes, you have to pull the historical context. Is there any critical knowledge in the comments that isn't already reflected in the code?
If it's that essential, maybe create a new, structured format of comments instead of completely removing them?
Absolutely. Instead of a giant journal, maybe create structured notes for specific functionalities in a new comment section within the source code file.
That makes sense. So, the key is to find the right balance.
Exactly. Clean code isn't just about removing stuff, it's about having the right amount of information available in the right places.
So, I'm seeing a clear difference between these journal comments and good, targeted documentation.
You got it. A well-maintained history in source control is a better way to manage the code's evolution.
This is helpful. Thanks, Robert.
You're welcome.
Robert, you mentioned earlier how crucial comments are, but the article seems to be arguing that sometimes they're just noise. Can you clarify that?
Absolutely. Sometimes comments just restate the obvious. They become redundant, like saying day of the month for the variable day of month. That's obvious.
Okay, so refactoring the code to make it crystal clear might be better?
Exactly. Often, messy try-catch blocks are a sign of code that needs reorganization. It's like writing a novel in a single paragraph. It can be hard to follow.
I see. Can you give an example of a messy try-catch block?
The example in the article shows a catch-all exception block inside another try/catch that is handling socket exceptions. It's not efficient.
So, how do we improve it?
Extract that exception handling into a separate method. This way, it becomes more modular, easier to test, and less prone to errors.
So, are there situations where comments are necessary?
Absolutely. Complex logic, or when explaining a tricky algorithm, should be documented. But comments should explain why something is done, not just what.
So the idea is to write code that's so clear that comments aren't needed most of the time?
That's the goal. Clean code reads like a well-written story.
Okay, that makes sense. So, if I have a try-catch block for something specific like a network error or a simple comment explaining why that block is needed is good?
Yes. But try to write the code itself so that the reason for the block is immediately clear.
Great. So, a good comment is an exceptional comment, not the norm.
Precisely. Prioritize clear code over excessive commenting. That's more efficient and sustainable.
Thanks, Rober. This has really helped me understand better. So, Robert, you've talked about clean code. What's your take on these position markers?
Yeah, comments like these. They can be a double-edged sword.
Double-edged? Why?
Often, they're just noise. Look, imagine a well-structured piece of code. A comment saying MW actions is, frankly, pretty much redundant.
Redundant? But isn't it useful to know what's going on?
Maybe sometimes. But often, the code itself should clearly convey that information. Too many markers and it's just clutter.
So, we're looking at a balance here?
Precisely. Clean, well-named variables and functions should communicate the process.
So, how do we know when a marker is useful?
Think of it like a note in a symphony. A note here or there enhances the music, but too many and it becomes a cacophony.
So, we should try to avoid unnecessary comments?
Exactly. Focus on writing code that's easy to understand.
So, what about those comments that are helpful?
Well, a comment that explains a truly complex calculation or the reason behind an unusual decision is perfectly fine, especially when this unusual decision is needed for future developers.
I see. So, the key is context?
Totally. Comments need context.
So if the code clearly explains the action, comments are unnecessary. Is this always true?
Generally, yes. But there might be exceptions.
What would be an example?
Maybe a team standard, or a case of technical debt.
Aha, I see.
Sometimes a marker is there to document historical decisions. But those should be handled differently.
Helpful to document where we are in the code.
Exactly. If the code itself can clearly explain the position, the comment is often unnecessary.
Makes sense. Robert, you've been talking about clean code. So, comments on closing braces, are they always a bad thing?
Not necessarily, but often it's a bad practice, especially for small functions. Usually short, self-contained functions are easier to follow.
I see. Can you explain why you think it's a bad idea?
It often leads to unnecessary clutter. If you find yourself needing a comment, often, it's a sign you could write a clearer function.
So, you're saying that making the function smaller is a better way to make it readable than adding a comment?
Precisely. Comments can add weight when the function is straightforward.
But what about incredibly complex functions with deep nesting?
In those cases, strategic comments can be useful, but even there, a well-named variable or a more logical structure are more helpful in the long run.
Right, it's about balance and context.
Yes, exactly. Conciseness often leads to elegance. Think of it like writing.
A good story?
Exactly. Too many details can muddy the plot, whereas focused language delivers a more impactful narrative.
Got it. So, in simple functions, a clearer function design is often more useful than a comment?
That's usually the case, yes.
Okay, so what about, like very deeply nested structures?
Well, that's where comments, used judiciously, can really save the day.
Right. A clear example would be helpful to illustrate.
Let's create an example.
Great. Let's see this in action.
Let me just quickly write a simple example. Writes code.
Okay, thanks. Now how does this apply to our prior example?
Explains, references example.
Aha, I see.
See how this is much clearer, without commenting every closing brace.
Makes perfect sense. Thanks for clarifying.
You're welcome.
So, Robert, you're saying source control is the primary way to track who did what, when? How does that play out in practice?
Yeah, Andrew. Think of it like a detailed history book for your code. Git, for instance, captures every change, every commit, with author details and timestamps. Much more reliable than a few byline comments scattered throughout the code.
But what about when you need to know why something was changed? Wouldn't some kind of documentation help there?
Absolutely. Source control is great for the who, when, and what, but comments are more for why. The key is using the right tool for the right job.
So, are there specific situations where comments are actually useful, or is source control always superior?
Well, short explanations directly within the code can be good for clarifying small changes or non-obvious logic. But those comments tend to quickly get outdated. Long-term, source control is vastly more robust.
I see. So, maybe a small, clarifying comment in a complex calculation might be good. But extensive comments become a maintenance burden?
Exactly. Consider a large team project. Comments can become outdated, inaccurate, and confusing very quickly.
You're suggesting we only use source control as our historical record. What about adding context or better understanding a feature?
Exactly. For in-depth context, use separate documentation, project wikis, or issue tracking, not inline comments.
That makes sense. So, what would be a good approach if you were working on a really large project in a big team and you were aiming for maximum transparency?
Leverage source control. Use issue trackers for reasons behind changes, and wikis for detailed explanations.
I see the value of source control as the baseline history. But are there ever exceptions for clarifying comments?
Sure. Small, focused notes on complex logic can be helpful, but keeping those succinct and using source control for the larger picture is ideal.
Thanks for clarifying that. So, we should lean toward minimal inline comments and utilize external resources for detailed explanations. Makes perfect sense.
Yes, Andrew. We want accurate, detailed records, and source control is the ideal place for that.
Great insight. Thanks, Robert.
You're welcome, Andrew.
Robert, you've seen some pretty messy code bases, right? What's your take on this commented out code? It seems like a real problem.
Totally. It's a code smell, a real pain. Commented out code is a ticking time bomb. It hides problems.
But, maybe sometimes you need a temporary fix, right?
Sure, if you are debugging or refactoring, you might need a temporary comment out, but it should be cleaned up quickly. Why clutter your code?
What if it's a legacy system? Lots of commented out code. How do you even start to tackle that?
That's where source control really shines. Git remembers everything. Just delete the code. It's a time saver in the long run.
But, maybe someone needed that for a reason.
Very rarely. Version control is the solution, not a temporary band-aid.
So if I'm looking at a project and I see tons of this commented out stuff, how should I approach fixing it?
Prioritize. Make it a team effort. Discuss. Try to find the context behind the comments. Sometimes that's useful, but most of the time, you need to eliminate.
So, you're saying delete aggressively?
Yes. Unless it's absolutely crucial to have that code again, get it out of there. Git handles it.
Got it, makes sense.
Think about the team. Clarity is key. Clean code makes a positive impact.
Thanks for the advice.
You're welcome. Clean code is about maintaining code clarity.
Really helpful. Hey Robert, we're diving into clean code today. What are your thoughts on comments? Are there any common mistakes people make when writing them?
Absolutely. Comments are crucial, but poorly written comments can be worse than no comments at all. One major issue is using HTML inside comments.
I see. Why is that a problem?
It makes comments hard to read in the editor or IDE. Imagine trying to navigate through a bunch of tags within your comments.
Right, that totally makes sense. So, you're saying tools should be responsible for formatting the comments for output, not the programmers?
Exactly. The programmer focuses on clear, concise, and informative content. Tools can handle the presentation aspect for things like JavaDoc output.
That makes a lot of sense. So how do we strike a balance between maintaining clear comments and avoiding HTML embeddedness?
It comes down to keeping your comments focused on what's happening, not how it looks. Let the tool handle the presentation for documentation purposes.
Okay. Can you provide an example of embedding HTML in comments that you would consider bad practice?
Sure. The example provided in this chunk with the ant task definition shows it clearly. Putting HTML tags like in comments within code is a bad habit.
Okay, I see. So you're saying we should keep it plain text and let the tools handle the output format?
Precisely. Let the tool create the output format. Keep the comments clear, precise, and let the tool do the HTML presentation in the documentation.
That's helpful. So, is there ever a reason to use HTML in comments?
Rarely, almost never. If there's a crucial need for special markup, use comments that aren't directly integrated in the code. There's probably a better way to approach the problem.
Makes sense. Great insight. Thanks, Robert. Hey, Robert. Thanks for joining us today. We're diving deep into clean code today, and let's start with comments. What are some key things to keep in mind when writing comments in code?
Absolutely, Andrew. Comments are important, but they can easily become a distraction if not done right. You want them to add value to the code, not just repeat what's already obvious.
So, you're saying comments should be specific, not just general?
Precisely. Look at this example. It's saying something about a default port, but the code has no control over it. That comment is useless. It needs to say what the code is doing, not what some other part of the system does.
Okay, that makes sense. How do I know when a comment is actually helpful? Then,
a good comment explains why the code is the way it is, or what it does in a unique, clarifying way. It points out non-obvious logic, a tricky algorithm, or a specific business reason.
okay, so no general explanations, but more focusing on the local context.
That's right. The comment should be like a helpful annotation right next to the related code. Think of it as a brief explanation specifically for that piece of code.
So, are there any alternatives to comments, Robert?
Yeah, well-structured code often speaks for itself. Use good variable names and functions to make the code readable without commenting on every single detail.
Interesting. What about really complex algorithms? How do you handle those?
For complex stuff, comments can still be helpful, but maybe a dedicated documentation section or a flowchart is better.
Okay, so commenting should be about clarification, not redundancy?
Exactly. Commenting is an extra step, and if it doesn't add more clarity, it's useless and can hurt readability.
I get it. Focus on the code itself. Thanks, Robert.
You're welcome, Andrew. Good commenting is about adding context, not just repeating information.
Awesome. Thanks again. That makes a lot more sense now. Hey, Robert, you mentioned clean code earlier. How do you handle writing comments? Are there some forbidden comment types?
Absolutely. A lot of the time, comments are there to explain why something was done, not what. A comment that just restates the obvious is rarely needed.
So, like if you've used a certain algorithm, is there a minimum level of explanation needed?
It depends on the context, Andrew. For general-purpose functions or standard algorithms, a simple declaration might be sufficient. But if it's a really bespoke or unusual solution, a brief explanation of why you chose a particular approach might be helpful.
So, comments shouldn't be encyclopedias?
Precisely. A comment that's packed full of historical context and obscure implementation details is a distraction.
But sometimes, legacy code has tons of those comments.
Precisely, that's a problem. We should be aiming for clarity, not exhaustiveness. There are better tools for historical context.
So, you're saying focusing on the function's purpose rather than its implementation history is key?
Absolutely. Imagine a 1,000-line function. Do you really need every detail in a comment?
That's a good point.
Instead, highlight the function's input, output, and purpose. Maintainability depends on that.
So, concise and focused then. Makes sense.
Yes, for overall maintainability. We're saying, let's not drown our code in details, and that's important.
Great point, Robert. Thanks.
You're welcome.
So, just to be clear, we should focus on the why and avoid detailed descriptions of how.
Exactly. That's the key takeaway, I think, Andrew.
Good to know.
You bet. A good comment is like a helpful footnote, not an entire history lesson.
So a comment that's too detailed is counterproductive?
Yes, absolutely.
Hey Robert, great to have you on the show. Today we're talking about clean code, and I'm really curious about comments.
Yeah, Andrew, comments are important, but they need to be useful.
So you're saying not all comments are created equal?
Exactly. This example from Apache Commons is a good case study. The comment about the byte array is confusing.
It is. Filter bytes, plus 200 bytes for header info. It's unclear. What are filter bytes?
Filter bytes are often used in image compression. They manipulate the pixel data for efficiency.
Oh, okay. So, it's not just about the raw pixel data?
No, filter bytes are part of the process for compressing the images.
So, what's the relationship to the +1 and 3 parts?
The +1 probably accounts for padding, for example. The width height 3 might be because an image is represented as RGB, 3 bytes for each pixel.
So, pixel is not a byte? Each pixel is 3 bytes?
Precisely. 200 bytes for header information. That depends on the specific image format. Often, there's metadata that defines the width, height, color space, etc., for proper display.
So, 200 is a rule of thumb, or a specific value?
It could be a typical value. It depends on the format. If the image is very complex, the header might be bigger.
So, the comment doesn't give much detail, just describes something that's already implied by the code itself.
Right. The comment should clarify why, not just what.
So, the clarity is key here, right? We need to communicate why the size is that particular size and the role of filter bytes.
Absolutely. A good comment should make the code easier to understand, not obscure the code, as this comment does.
Thanks, Robert. That makes perfect sense.
My pleasure, Andrew.
This highlights the importance of thoughtful and clear comments.
Exactly. Clarity improves collaboration and maintenance.
Robert, you're saying a great function name is more important than a comment?
Exactly, Andrew. A good name tells the story. Imagine a file cabinet. A clear label is better than a detailed description inside.
But what if the function does something complex?
Well, a well-structured function already expresses a clear logic internally.
Right. But what if it's a bit convoluted?
Even then, try to make the function name reflect the intention of the code, not the implementation details. You might need a comment in that situation, but it should be exceptional, not a norm.
That makes sense. So, give me an example.
Instead of calculate customer discount, consider apply tiered discount. It instantly conveys the function's purpose.
Okay, I get that. But what about error handling?
Error handling in a separate function and using meaningful names for those functions would be preferred.
So, for something like calculating Fibonacci sequence, a complex algorithm,
A good function name would be something like calculate nth Fibonacci. The intent is clear, and the function itself should be well structured.
a good name gives the big picture.
Precisely. The code should be a form of self-documentation. A function doing one thing is the key.
You're saying short, expressive names, like you said before?
Yes. Concise code is much easier to maintain and understand in the long run. It becomes self-explanatory, and that's the mark of quality.
I see. It's all about expressing what the function does, not necessarily how it does it.
Exactly. Focus on expressing the high-level intent.
So, comments are not completely obsolete?
No, but they should be exceptions. Exceptional situations, truly unusual algorithms, or where a small comment really clarifies something specific, then yes.
Makes sense. Thanks for the insight.
Always welcome, Andrew.